tell me a little bit about this genome sequencing lab and the work you guys are doing there.
Sure. So we've been set up to do DNA sequencing for years, and we've worked some with physicians. But with the outbreak of the pandemic, we approached the folks in the health system to say, is there any interest in us doing some genome sequencing of the strains? And initially, last fall and summer, not really, they weren't really that interested. People hadn't really become aware that there were these different strains, and they were doing their testing and everything was fine. But then over the winter, we began to hear about strains, and so they came back to us, and we've been working closely with them to do sequencing of the positive strains that are coming up on campus among the students, the staff, the faculty. And so we're now trying to sort of monitor and keep an eye out for whether any of these strains of concern are coming into the local community.
And why is sequencing so important? What's the whole point behind it?
So, no, that's a great question. The rapid test, excuse me, and the PCR test can tell you whether you're infected, but they can't tell you which strain you have. And so the way we tell the strains apart is by sequencing the virus's genome, which is about 23,000 letters. And there are certain places in the genome that are mutated and modified where we know if we look at that site and we see something different, that tells us, oh, okay, we've got a certain strain here that's different from the original.
And does that help with tracking spread or the course of the pandemic and vaccines and all of that sort of thing?
So we're trying to figure that out. There certainly is an indication that some of these strains spread faster, and if we see those strains come into our community, we want to be aware of those, particularly the UK strain, because it is one of the reported consequences is that you're infectious for longer. And so right now we ask people to quarantine for 2 weeks, but the UK strain, you might be infectious for more like, 16 or 17 days. So if you only quarantine for 2 weeks, you're coming out of quarantine too soon. So it'd be really helpful to know which strain someone has so that we can, on the other hand, we don't want to make everybody go into quarantine for longer because that's wasting their time and keeping them away from the things they want to do. So that's, but also it may turn out that some of these strains are um, that certain vaccines don't protect us against certain strains. We don't know that yet, but that's certainly something we're going to be watching. And the only way we can learn that is by doing this kind of sequencing effort.
And I was reading that the original Wuhan strain isn't even the dominant one anymore. You guys aren't really finding it. So is that surprising to you?
It didn't surprise us because other people had seen that as well. So the original Wuhan strain was replaced in the middle of last year almost completely by a strain that had one difference in the spike protein that is the sort of what gives these viruses their names is this so-called spike protein, and it's also the part of the virus that docks onto your cells so the virus can get into the cell. So the thought is that difference from the Wuhan strain makes the virus, um, it basically makes it easier for the virus to get inside your cells, which is of course good for the virus, but not good for us. And so that strain spread because it was more infective. And so you don't see the original around anymore because that one's outcompeted it basically. So
So the pandemic or the virus kind of evolved has evolved so much at this point that that's not even a dominant one here. It's kind of
yeah.
interesting to see the evolution, I guess, of this pandemic. But I was reading on the CDC website, and they're tracking all the different variants and how much sequencing is happening. And I looked at North Carolina, and less than 0.30% of the samples here are being sequenced. Is that a little bit of a concern, and why are so few being sequenced here?
I think it is a concern. It's not an immediate issue because most of the time we would have the same treatment for somebody regardless of which strain they had, except maybe we would ask them to quarantine for longer, as I was mentioning. But in the longer term, it is a concern because we need to keep track of the strains because that's the only way we're going to learn whether vaccines are starting to not work anymore. So, for instance, with flu, there's a new flu vaccine every couple of years because the flu evolves away from the vaccine that exists. that will probably eventually happen for coronavirus, but we don't know when. And the only way we're going to know is by tracking. So I think that the two answers to your questions, not an immediate issue, but certainly something we want to be watching for the longer term. Now, why we're doing so little sequencing in North Carolina, um, almost all the sequencing nationwide is actually being done at universities right now. There's very little that is state mandated. And the places that are doing more sequencing, it's because they have universities that have stepped up and filled in that gap. So we're hoping that in the longer term, the CDC and the federal government will work together to figure out what the right level and sampling the most prudent and cost-effective way to do that will be. Obviously, we don't want to sequence everything. That wouldn't be a good use of our resources. So, but right now it's rather ad hoc. Yeah.
And with the vaccines coming on board and more people getting those, do you anticipate doing less or more sequencing in the months to come?
I think unfortunately we'll be doing more sequencing. Um, right now, we're seeing a little bump in which I hope stays little. Things were declining after students went away for winter break and they came back, and we did see higher caseloads then, but it was declining in February. But unfortunately, we're seeing numbers rise again. So um, I guess I don't want to be in business doing this, but that the reality is we're going to try and sequence every positive case on campus here. That's in the students, the staff, the faculty, and in February that was, you know, 10 to 20 a week, but this week we're seeing bigger numbers, and I'm hoping it doesn't mean that they're going to keep going up.
And do you think maybe what you're seeing here on campus is a sort of a reflection of what's going out in the or going on in the greater community? Does that give us a good perspective of what's going on in the big picture?
I think it gives us a pretty good picture of what's happening in the more urban settings, where you might have still a fair bit of business travel and students coming to and from home and vacation and back to campus and so forth. I imagine in the rural communities where you have less out of state travelers coming in and out, there's going to be less transfer of those strains initially. Of course, eventually they're going to spread, but they're going to come into the cities first. So we, for instance, we know that we have picked up a couple of the so-called California strain in our sequencing, and those are in students, and those students went home for vacation, and so that's inevitably going to be something that facilitates the spread of these new strains is just people moving around. So another reason we need to kind of keep track. We can't assume the UK strain is going to stay in UK and the California strain is going to stay in California. We know that's not going to be the case. So